Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Let's Talk Business, episode number 5. And joining me now is Steve Hall. Steve is the Vice President at FGP, or Find Great People. And FGP is a staffing firm, a search firm, and a consulting firm headquartered right here in Greenville, but they have offices over in Charleston, which hasn't been there too long, I don't think. Steve's going to tell me here in a second, but also in Columbia, and even, if I'm right, in Nashville, Tennessee. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So 4 offices headquartered here in Greenville.
Yeah.
The newest office is Daniel Island, so that was back in March.
That's a tough gig, man. That's a tough gig.
Well, sometimes the travel down is not so quick anymore.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And it's a hot place to be this time of year, but it's hot everywhere.
Yeah.
So, but Nashville.
Yeah.
How long have you been in Nashville?
We've been in Nashville since 2016 in terms of an office there, but we've had clients there for almost 20 years.
Okay. And why Nashville?
It's all tied to the healthcare space. That's sort of the mecca for healthcare in the United States.
Yeah.
And we've had several clients that were based there. And so one of our former clients said, I want to come work for you. And we said, we'd love to have you. Right. So that's how that got started.
I got it. No ties to the country music industry in any way.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, all right, just checking. Okay, before we get into things and I start asking you some questions, let's start with your services, FGP. Mm-hmm. I mean, I mentioned them up front. Of course, you're a staffing agency, but you're so much more than that. Let's talk about what you do provide.
Okay, so we do 3 things. Yeah. We find talent, and that's executive search, professional level search, and then the staffing that you referred to, or contract to hire. And then secondly, we help develop and retain talent. That's that middle component. So many people are focused on the front door, which is the acquisition component. They are not paying as much attention to the development and retention. And then the third piece is the transition side of the business. Yeah. There are times where you might decide that an individual or a department, or hopefully not, but an entire company needs to go away. And there's a compassionate way to do that. Yes. And we provide that compassionate route.
Got it. Let's go back to retention for a second. Talk a little bit more about that. I didn't stop to think about that aspect of it, but what does that look like?
Well, think about individuals on your team that are of high potential. Mm-hmm. They may be earlier in their careers, or they may not have actually been in leadership before, but their maturity or their performance gives them the right to be considered for a higher level role in leading people, or maybe even leading process. But as is often the case, if you just simply promote, you may be actually hurting them and you in the process. And so we have a team that works on things like executive coaching, leadership development, supervisor coaching. And then you just have the other aspects of outsourced HR and fractional HR for organizations that are smaller in nature. I was having a conversation just the other day with an owner of a company, and I said, hey, who does the HR? And he said, I do. And I said, that's not a great idea.
Right. Fractional hiring is becoming so much more popular these days.
So some of that is a function of the demand exceeds the supply. And so whether that be a CFO or somebody at the executive level, but you can just carry that formula down into whatever level department you might be thinking of.
You know, so much has happened over the last few years, right? In March of 2020, our world's changed, and so many industries were impacted in so many different ways. But my gosh, the staffing industry, the employment industry, of course, was impacted greatly. And so what we saw here in South Carolina was, and let's just stay here in Greenville for a second, unemployment rates were at 2.6, 2.7. We're talking historically good numbers. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, they go well into the double digits. The hospitality industry tanks. It takes a while. People start coming back. All of a sudden, employees have a little more leverage than they've ever had before because of remote work. Yeah. And then you have something called the Great Resignation that occurred. And now all of a sudden it seems that we are morphing again. So all that being said, where are we today?
Well, so it's interesting that you mentioned the Great Resignation. Paychecks who you may be familiar with as a payroll company, national firm, they did a survey last fall, so the fourth quarter. 57% of the employees they surveyed, and I don't remember the exact total number, but 57% of them said they regret the Great Resignation.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is that the jobs that they were promised didn't turn out to be exactly as great as they promised. And then in other cases, they just missed the employees and the family that they were at and some of the camaraderie and the culture. So while there was a Great Resignation, it didn't necessarily all turn out positive. And there's an old saying, which people maybe are familiar with, the grass is always greener on the other side.
Yeah.
But they don't hear the other side of that, which is you still have to mow that grass.
That's funny.
And so that's what has, I think, happened in some cases during that Great Resignation. With regard to the rest of the market, basically, I would say the labor shortage is not going to go away. The baby boom generation, there's just more of them than there are of my generation, Gen X. And so we can't make that up overnight. And so it's the millennials and the Gen Zs coming behind that actually is that next wave. And so by 2030, just in a few years, 90% of the workforce in the United States will be millennial and Gen Z, because people like me will be hopefully retired.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes me nervous, Steve. I think it makes me nervous.
What, that I'm retiring?
Oh, well, that too. That too. That too. So there were so many remote jobs for a while, right? You had to do it because, the company that I worked for, they required it. They required people to work remote for some reason. And, it was one of those things that I went into kicking and screaming a little bit. We can't do this. We can't do this. We all found out that it could be done.
Right.
We all found it could be done. And so what occurred at that point when we discovered that it could be done is companies wanted to save on brick and mortar. And so now, there were more jobs than ever being remote. But where are we now? Is that going to continue to be a big percent of the employees on a company's payroll remote? Or will that slowly dissipate and we're back to where we were?
So I don't really see the majority of employers back to 100% in office. I would say hybrid is probably the new normal for many, many years to come. Remote will not go away for certain types of roles in certain types of industries. Take, for example, the tech sector. It's still predominantly remote, and they have leverage on that. And they maybe even have a good argument for that. Yeah. On the other hand, if you talk to most business leaders around the country, you will hear, I really would like to have our team back in the office. And if you ask why, there are many reasons, but one that really comes to mind is by the 100% remote, you've really lost your culture. Well, that's an advantage and an edge as to why you'd want to come work for me. And so I believe that most of us are saying it's time.
Yeah.
But I don't think all in all the time is necessarily the model that we're going to see going forward.
Yeah, I agree with you. We've lost camaraderie and we've lost some team aspect.
Yeah.
Maybe not completely, but we have lost some degree of it.
Yeah, I mean, if you just one thing to think about, if we're all remote,
yeah,
and I have no real connectivity to you other than the screen,
yeah,
then if I get a call from somebody like FGP about a new shiny object,
yes,
and it's just more money, well, then it's easier for me to disengage and pursue that. So there's lots of reasons why I think the in-person has value, but at least from a cultural retention component, I think it's a necessary component.
I didn't think about it that way, but you're talking about loss of loyalty because
Right.
we're not sitting beside each other every day.
Yeah.
Right. Relationships dwindle.
That's correct.
In some regard. Makes sense. A couple more things, Steve. From an employer's perspective, what do hiring managers need to know or do to remain competitive these days?
Well, compensation is an important component.
Always.
And unfortunately, some organizations, that's state government, federal government, that's nonprofit, that's business, still are lacking the fortitude and understanding that they have got to pay a competitive wage to attract and then to keep the talent. I think the challenge there is if I have 10 people on my team and they're all at this or roughly this range, and I bring Rick in brand new and he gets a 20 grand increase, now we've got an inequity. And what do I do about that? And some would argue, well, you should have been incrementally increasing those salaries anyway. So it's a tough thing to do, but if you don't do that, you're not going to attract the really high quality talent, and you will probably lose the talent you have because you're not making adjustments anyway. In addition to that, I would say the flexibility of the work schedule, which we've already talked about. I think you need to be willing to have some creativity around that for your team. And then maybe another aspect of this is, in my opinion, you need to be willing to top grade your talent. And what I simply mean by that is, I don't have any openings in my company, on my team, in my department, but I see walking by an amazing talent. I wish I could hire that person, but I don't have an opening. Well, you probably do have an opening if you'd be willing to part with one of your underperformers. And so that is what top grading would consist of.
Steve, good information, man. Good
Thank
stuff. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much.
Folks, that is Steve Hall. He is the Vice President at FGP, or Find Great People. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be back here in just about 30, 45 seconds, and I'm going to be talking with Jody Bryson, the CEO at SC TAC. See you soon.